This video is part 3 of my coverage of Sufism and the Islamic tradition for PSY 230 personality theory. Some concepts that will help you to deepen your understanding of this tradition are referred to as annihilation and return. Annihilation, when I read that word, I usually think of it in terms of blowing things up, destroying things. But in this tradition, it's more focused on individual identity being dismantled, and that's not really the best word, being transcended. And then a union emerges, fana, and it represents the wholeness of reality. In this state, and it really is seen as a state of consciousness, there is no distinction, no barrier, no separation between self and the divine, or self and God. So when this union, what's being annihilated basically is ego. And we've heard a similar kind of sentiment in Buddhism and in Hinduism, where transcendence really requires an absence of self, an annihilation of self. The return, bhaka, one can be part of the world, but not worried by it, not overly concerned by it. So you can persist within this state of the world, but no longer be compelled to react to those things, those egoic concerns. Again, we've heard similar kinds of thoughts, similar kinds of ideas in Hinduism and Buddhism. So to connect some dots here, the fana is this state of disintegration of the ego self, this narrow sense of independent being that has limited the person specifically in terms of their capacity to be deeply connected to the divine. The bhaka is the reintegration of the capital S self, which is a fully integrated, fully developed, fully functioning human in deep communal connection with the divine. Development is described as moving from a state of initial awakening, where the person, and remember back to when we did in the chapter on Zen Buddhism, that story, that metaphor of the seeking of the ox. You have an initial awakening stage where the person has identified that they want to change, they want to learn, they are seeking. And part of the Sufi tradition is adopting a stance of forgiveness for all that they have done and that they feel they have been wronged by, or that they have wronged. This state of repentance, this state of turning away from old behaviors, represents the initial awakening. The next stage is engaging in a state of patience and gratitude, which is a part of the Sufi practice of, if you're talking about meditation and prayer, the person learns through discipline that they can, through the practice of prayer and meditation, acquire this kind of highly focused attention. That's really similar to what we've seen in both Hinduism and Buddhism. The stage of fear and hope is kind of a reconceptualization of one's relationship with the divine. For many, they are preoccupied by a sense of fearing the divine, of fearing God. It's not a state of fearing being punishment, fearing being punished, as we would see in some evangelical Christian teachings, but the fear of losing the love of the beloved, of the divine. So it's perceiving a possibility of lack, of saying, what if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not capable of doing what is necessary to have this deep personal connection to the divine? The hope part of it allows people to see the path that is possible. And in that way, you're moving away from fear and into a state of hope. Then there is an emphasis on self-denial, on the idea that you have to stop doing wrong things and you have to start doing right things. In Zen Buddhism, you had these concepts of right thought and right action and right work and so on and so on. There is a specification of how you should live your life as a human being, what you shouldn't do, what you should do. And the purpose of all of that, self-denial and poverty, is to acutely develop the sense of self-awareness and detachment from worldly things and worldly needs. So it's by framing a really rigid set of rules, the goal is to really kind of transcend those lower levels of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, transcending the need to pay attention to those deficit states, losing, therefore, an emphasis, a reliance, a commitment to these kinds of labels and concepts of what we have to have and what we need. Think of the concrete example of how on social media these days people kind of curate a beautiful image of how they're living, taking shots of their food or their new decor or their new outfit as a way of signaling to others in the world how well they're doing. And the idea in Sufism would be, okay, you have to let go of those things. You have to let go of the beautiful images of food, the beautiful images of your home, the beautiful images of your physical body. You have to let that go because over-focus on those things attaches you to them emotionally and leaves no room for developing emotional attachment and emotional connection and communion with the divine. The next stage is developing a deep trust in the divine, a deep trust in God. And there, when the idea is that by engaging in this deep practice and engaging in the Sufi practice, you recognize that your growth is dependent on the grace of God. And you have to trust in God that God will make that possible for you. You are what you are doing in terms of your practice and your study is a part of this larger, this larger process, this larger state or system that you're currently not aware of, but you can move toward. That the next step is being in a state of yearning, of love. The Rumi poetry, if you ever really get interested in this, you'll see just the longing, the depth of the intimacy of the love that is described, the love for the divine. As the personality develops, the love for God transcends all other kinds of love. Sufism really emphasizes this idea that you can have this fully integrated psyche, and the real key peak component of that is full integration with the divine. Feeling satisfied, feeling happy comes from a deep understanding that all things come from God. All things are filled with the divine. So there's, this simultaneously, you love and you want that intimate connection. And by understanding that all things are from God, that's when that can come. Next, you have an emphasis on intentional pursuit of honesty and truthfulness. This, reminds me of right wisdom in Buddhism, where you have the people who are intentional in their choices, they're intentional in their thoughts, they're intentional in what they choose. And by engaging in that kind of intentionality, the person is kind of shifting their focus to living with a kind of integrity that is connected to their faith. And that then opens the door to living a life of contemplation, not unlike that really kind of deep contemplation that you see both in the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions, where a person who engages in actual deep self-examination, what they're doing is they're nurturing their relationship with the divine, and allowing it to blossom. The next stage, the recollection of death, is placing an understanding into consciousness that your own current form has a finite existence. So thinking about, an outgrowth of this contemplation and self-examination is the capacity to think about hard things. So we think about our own death and use that thought to become more acutely aware of your current state of thinking. Again, this reminds me of right wisdom in the Zen Buddhist tradition. Part of wisdom is understanding the flow of existence. The concept of heedlessness, from a Western perspective, is often really difficult to grasp. The assumption is that your present waking conscious awareness isn't enough. It's a delusion. It's sort of a cover that hides from you the ultimate sense of being. It's argued within the Sufi tradition that in our practice, in our communion, we have to learn how to think outside of the box that our conscious lives has created for us, and be able to use our imagination and our capacity for intellect to grow beyond that limitation. Waking, as your authors describe it, the first symptom of waking is suspecting that there's more to whatever's going on, that there's more there that you are needing to discover. And that waking state becomes an object of thought itself. It's kind of like coming to the recognition, there just has to be more than this. There has to be more. And for the Sufi tradition, the awakening in the context of faith says the more that there is connected to the divine, is connected to the relationship with God. So the first step in overcoming heedlessness is to become aware of it.
Now that's all very well as the beginning for the spiritual life amongst those people who are gifted with this kind of remembering of what they once had. But what of those souls which feel this yearning only very vaguely or in very infrequent moments, or seemingly not at all? Well, such people are in the Islamic understanding victims of something called the thickness of the world. Very direct image. Okay, mystical term, the kathafa. The veil has become very thick for them. They can no longer see through it. The divine beloved. So these people are victims, as it were, of the negative possibilities of the world. The world, this complex of phenomena in which we find ourselves, is a two-edged sword. It's true that, as the Quran says, constantly celebrates, it recalls and reminds us of its divine origin. However, the same world can also veil and obscure it, because we become too obsessed with the signpost that we no longer see where the sign is pointing. Most human beings, marinated, as it were, from birth in a kind of worldliness because of their upbringing, because of their culture, distracted by the sheer brilliance and multiplicity of creation, simply find it hard to see through the world and perceive or even intuit what might lie behind it. This error can be both mental. We presume from the evidence of our senses that the world represents all that can exist, which is the error of contemporary philosophy. And also it can be spiritual, because our innate knowledge of God with which we were born, remember Islam doesn't recognize the concept of original sin, our innate knowledge of God which gives us the ability to recognize the works of God as works of God has somehow atrophied. And this problem, which is the product of khatata, of the illusory thickness of the world, is famously referred to as ghafla. The GH sound is pronounced roughly like the French R. It's a kind of guttural R, ghafla. This means heedlessness, forgetfulness. And this is the state of most human beings. And this is why the beginning of the spiritual path in Islam is not so much a repentance as a turning or a returning. Turning away from the things we consider to be real but aren't, back towards what we once knew to be real. It's a remembering, a dhikr. Dhikr and ghafla are polar opposites. The dhikr means remembrance, recollection, also reminding oneself, invocation. Now, the classic Muslim text on how to overcome this sickness of ghafla is, as always, the Holy Quran itself. The Quran is there to articulate for us a vision of the world which we all had before we were born. Hence, I think it's surprising and to some even disconcerting literary style. The Quran's intention is not to supply us with information that we never had, but simply to unearth it from our souls. So the normal discursive linear techniques of, say, history books or novels are simply nowhere in sight in the Quran. It speaks directly to the heart, constantly pushing, remembering, challenging. And it has to be listened to with the heart. And there are many verses in the Quran itself which indicate this non-ratiocinative nature of God's speech. For instance, where it proclaims, God has placed covers over the hearts of those who have no faith in the other world, lest they should understand it, the Quran, and he has set a barrier over their ears. Note, by the way, that the text is not here just referring to Muslims. It merely says that the key to lifting the veil from the Quran is faith. So if you come to the Quran from a position of unfaith, you will merely see a mirror of yourself in the Quran. If you come to it with a higher degree of spirituality, the Quran here suggests that it doesn't have to be something achieved simply or exclusively within a Muslim context. Then you will begin to see something deeper. And of course the great saints, their delight famously in Islamic hagiography is that they are inseparable from the Quran. They read the Quran constantly, they recite from it, they find it a constant delight. As one of them said, the Quran is God's banquet.
So what I like about that video, I mean, he's going beyond just Sufism, but more broadly speaking about Islam. He explains in a much fuller, richer way than I could, certainly, this idea of heedlessness and the position it's placed in the context of Islam and Islamic experience. Now, one area that I think really probably would resonate with a lot of you based on some of the ways in which you've interacted with your text over the course of the semester is the way in which the Sufi tradition uses the concept of friendship. Seeing others as family is really central to the Sufi tradition. And that means, you know, if you are in friendship, you will provide material things to your companions. You will provide personal support to your people. You will respect them. You will not complain about them or gossip about them. And that reminds me of, some of the right speech dictum in Zen Buddhism, that you aren't to complain, you aren't to whine, you aren't to tease and harass, and you're not to give advice that other people can't act on. And you're not to gossip, and so on. That's a part of being respectful. That's a part of being a real, true friend. And providing praise and attention to people that when they need it, is something that friends should do. Like many aspects of the Sufi tradition, this is very, very clear advice on how people should comport themselves. Like in Zen Buddhism, the Eightfold Path is very specific. It's very prescriptive of what a well-lived life involves. And in Sufism, the way people should behave toward others that are in their atmosphere is in a state of friendship. The fifth element of friendship is being deeply capable of forgiveness. Human beings have failings. They make mistakes. They are flawed. And being fundamentally in a position of forgiveness is critical. Being in a state of prayer for your companions means that you value them as you value all. Because remember, God is in all. And if God is in you, God is in your companions. So it is your responsibility to be in a state of prayer for others, as you would be hoping others would be in a state of prayer for you. It is assumed that loyalty is a requirement. You are to, if you are in friendship, you trust others and they trust you. And there's also an assumption that friendship provides, or it should provide, relief. It is your job in your friendship state not to create bad situations for others, not to cause them harm, and not to become a burden on them. So in these recommendations, these prescriptive requirements, what the Sufis are really outlining is how you should be in the world in relation to those with whom you have immediate interactions. So it's really a prescription for how to live a well-lived life, how to live in the world of other people in a way that enhances your capacity to reflect your relationship with God, and how to make it more likely that those who surround you will also have that same opportunity. And that concludes my coverage of Sufi and the Islamic tradition.